Hello everybody, this is Clara Iannotta and this lecture is called Moulting Spaces. Today I would like to talk about a part of my compositional research that I have been working on for the past few years, which is still developing and incomplete. The topics and questions I'll talk about have arisen while composing some of my recent music and continue to be inspired by artists whose work connects with or forces me to question my own. Like many composers, I have been fascinated with how to represent time and space in music, and how form and the sonic material that we use are extremely related. If you were to analyze all the fugues written by Bach, you would notice that they are all different and that their form changes depending on the material used, in this case the subject of the fugue. I used to think about my sounds as complex, handmade, personal objects, but for a long time it didn't interest me which boxes I would put my objects in. I was not bothered by the fact that no matter which sonic material I used, the form of my pieces was always AB, A prime, or ABC. But the more experience I gained and the more complex sounds I could create, the more aware I became of the fact that form can completely reshape the material you use, which means it can weaken or strengthen it. As I was working on shaping my sounds, I started to analyze the energy that those sounds carry, trying to build a surrounding space that fits them and them only. Instead of only focusing on my objects, I started to think about the box that contains my objects. In 2011, during a conversation, Pierluigi Billone told me that he sees form as the space that surrounds the sound, which is not far from Luigi Nono, who said, "Il suono legge lo spazio," sound reads space. During the past years, I have had many conversations with my colleagues about form and time, and the notion of space was somehow always present. A few years ago, Rebecca Saunders was talking to me about her orchestra piece Void, which she was composing for the Witten Festival. She knew that the acoustic of the hall where the piece would be performed was very dry and not suitable for such a piece, so she told me that she was bringing the space with her. She was composing the space which she thought would fit her sounds. Like also in Luigi Nono's music, space is not only seen as form, but becomes material itself. If the form of Bach's fugues changes depending on the sonic material he uses, the subject of the fugue, that implies that an object affects the space that surrounds it. But is there a way to give agency to form as well, so as to create a constant exchange between the sonic material and the space that surrounds it? Sound is an abstract word, and I constantly struggle to find the right words to describe it. In order to overcome this struggle, I normally try to find a concept or a metaphor that can help me navigate the abstract realm that sound is. And most of the time, relying on metaphors helps me not only to understand better my sonic material, but also hands me new, sometimes completely unexpected perspectives, which lead me to sonic territories that I haven't explored before. If we think about how space affects sonic material and vice versa, we can look at works of visual art and literature that can serve as metaphors to understand this relationship. For example, British visual artist Rachel Whiteread and her idea of negative space, and the art book Tree of Codes by American writer Jonathan Safran Foer both display inspiring ways of thinking about form. By casting the space within and around objects, Rachel Whiteread creates a negative imprint of the object itself, memorializing its space. As this picture shows, you are not looking at the stairs themselves, but at the space where the stairs were. Whiteread casts the absence of objects. Their absence becomes material and the object of investigation. Three of Codes by Jonathan Safran Foer is an art object in the form of a book published in 2010. Foer took one of his favorite books, The Street of Crocodiles by Bruno Schulz, and removed the majority of the words, introducing empty spaces instead. The artifacts created by this technique challenge the traditional reading experience, allowing words to be combined with each other, following more than the usual horizontal direction. Letters hide words, pages blend with each other, appearing and disappearing. The space left by the absence of the cut-out words is used as material, and the artifacts produced by this carving process constantly affect both object and form, opening to a multiplicity of readings. In 2019, I composed Molt, an orchestra piece inspired by the biological process of molting, which is the manner in which an animal routinely casts off a part of its body, often but not always an outer layer or covering, either at specific times of the year or at specific points in its life cycle. This process allows animals to grow by renewing their feathers, like in birds, their skin, like in reptiles, or their entire body, like in insects. Among all animals, spiders fascinated me the most. When a spider molts, it sheds its exoskeleton, renewing itself and leaving behind the material imprint of its body, climbing out of a ghost or shadow of its own form. This is a vital but vulnerable process. Insects stop breathing while molting. The freshly molted body is soft and unprotected, but the new skin gives an animal space to grow. The double temporality of the animal and its cast-off shell fascinate me. We are confronted with the physical trace of the past within the movement of the present, a vision of the self split across time. In my piece Molt, I try to imagine the orchestra as an animal that can shed its skin, shedding pasts that continue to haunt the form of the piece. Like Rachel Whiteread casts the space around and between objects, leaving behind a trace of the space the object occupied, so the spider leaves its own empty shell behind. Every time the spider molts, its past is cast. Time, what it was and what it is now, becomes tangible. As a composer, I was intrigued by this whole concept, and I started to think how to create and use tangible temporalities in my music. I took the recording of my string quartet, that Wasps in the Gem Jar 3, which was the latest piece composed before Molt. I applied 9 different time stretches to the live recording of the string quartet, and then recorded each result again on 9 old cassette players. The idea of tangible past was represented by the use of a physical object, the cassette player with its very defined and familiar recognizable sound, by the recording of an old piece of mine, and by my navigation within the temporalities of that recording, the 9 time stretches. This process allowed me to create a physical sonic object as pre-recorded tape and to compose the space surrounding it with the orchestra playing in real time. The molting process creates an exchange between the internal and external space of the animal, and it was important for me to apply the same idea to the piece by searching for sounds and techniques which could merge the tapes with the acoustic instruments. Because of the extreme time stretches that I used, the loss of resolution in the pre-recorded sounds created a lot of artifacts, adding noise, distortion, blurriness, and compression to the original recordings. In order to reorchestrate these artifacts, I had to prepare many of the acoustic instruments at my disposal, adding objects and using techniques which will make the sound extremely unstable. I will show you now some of the techniques that I used, above all the techniques that I used on the acoustic instrument on the orchestra, trying to basically match and transform the sounds and the artifacts that I already had in the cassettes. So for example, in the top left, you will see the preparation that some of the strings have, so these paper clips, and you have to imagine that what I tried to do, it was almost like pressurizing the register of the instrument, and so the bow passes between the 4 paper clips, and I would obtain by using this technique a lot of artifacts, and not only by pressing the bow and changing the speed of the bow or the pressure of the bow, of course, but also using the left hand, even just sliding across the strings. And now I will play a little example on the electric guitar, which was also prepared with the same paper clips. Okay. Okay, as I said, by applying these extreme time stretches to the recording of the string quartet, I obtained quite a lot of distortion and artifacts and noises, and at the same time the sound became extremely unstable. And so I was trying to find some techniques that could deliver exactly the same effect. And so, for example, in the electric guitar that I will play now, you will hear a lot of distortion. So the sound is embedded inside the distortion, but at the same time you hear constant feedbacks that are like my kind of artifacts. Okay, I would just play now. Same concept is also applied to the piano, that is using an EBow machine, so also the same technology as the guitar. And I use several other techniques, of course. Here I'm just showing some of them, but for example, as you see, some of the strings were prepared with aluminum foil around the strings, and so when bowed, for example, you could hear the tin foil, the aluminum touching each other, but at the same time also the bow and the wood of the bow rubbing on the tin foil. Or for example, the granulation obtained in the strings by the Padafix preparation. I will just play a little example. By doing so, I could compose the exchange between internal and external space, allowing the orchestra at times to embody the cassettes and at times to be the space surrounding them. Before, I said that composing a form or space around musical material can change the musical material itself. This was exactly the experience I had while working on Moult. Depending on the space I created around the cassettes, how the cassettes themselves were perceived changed. By moving between the spider's internal and external forms while writing the orchestral part, I could change the perspective with which we hear the relatively continuous material of the cassettes. I will now show 2 examples of the score of Moult and explain them a tiny bit. So in this first example, you will hear the moment in which the cassettes stop. And so you hear sort of what it was in the tape, actually a complete still sound, but in the cassettes it's moving almost like an irregular tremolo. Then there is the orchestra that plays completely without the cassettes, okay, and then the orchestra and cassettes restart again. Okay, I will just play 1 second and show you the score at the same time. I will show you now another example of the score. And here, basically, this is the last part of the piece. What you will hear is the complete blend merged between the cassettes and the orchestra. And then you will hear the cassettes completely stopping. And then the orchestra keeps going. I will just play these few pages. While I was doing these extreme time stretches to use in my cassettes, I thought about the fact that when you stretch a physical object, its material might not be consistent, which means that if you stretch it, it loses its shape and reveals the places in the material that are weaker or that have a specific quality. These inconsistent parts will stretch differently than the rest of the object. They'll break or change their shape. Stretching means to zoom into the sound, compromising its quality by losing resolution. The computer struggles to reassemble the sounds from the data it has, and you end up with a lot of weird sounds because you're moving through the audio wave in a way it was not designed for. What was fascinating to me was the fact that the act of stretching was revealing the material of the physical object I was using, and that the now compromised quality of the data was creating a variety of artifacts that were changing the shape of the overall sonic material. As I mentioned previously in Mould, I reorchestrated the artifacts obtained in the cassettes using instrument preparations, objects, and so on. I then started to think about how to have an acoustic time stretch that happened in real time, so that I could reshape not only the temporality, but also the physical object itself. In Jonathan Safran Foer's tree of codes, the artifacts produced by the carving process affect not only the material, but the object itself. The words, at times reduced to shredded letters, float inside the pages, losing their meaning, forced to build new, at times only visual connections. The book is not a book anymore, it becomes a sculpture in the shape of a book. Similarly to how Safran Foer's localized process of filtering and carving words transforms the overall form and function of the book, I wanted to create a process through the production of artifacts which would affect the sonic material as well as the physicality of the instrument. I took this approach while composing the string quartet You Crawl Over Seas of Granite. I heavily detuned all 16 strings of the quartet such that their physical vibration would become unpredictable, creating an unstable sonic result. Long notes were extremely difficult to sustain, and the less movement of the hands I would use, the more the sound itself would move and change. I will show you two examples of this score. So in the first examples, you will see that the left hand of the four musicians is just not moving at all. Only the bow really slowly changes, so it goes from sul ponticello to molto alto sul tasto. But as you will see, the sound just keeps constantly changing. I will just play 1 second. In the second example, what I'm about to play now, you will actually start from a situation in which there is a lot of movement of both hands, and then it goes towards a more stillness moment. So actually they are not moving, but as you will hear, the sound will keep moving, whether it is there is an actual movement of the hands, of both hands, or not at all. I will just play this part. At the beginning of this lecture, I talked about how form can be completely derived from the material. This was very clear to me when analyzing Bach's fugues or trio of chords. At the same time, the function of the space surrounding sounds is not only to fit and be molded by the material, but can have an active role in shaping the material as well. In a certain way, form is not a rigid box around the sounds. It has blurry edges, and, like in the work of Rachel Whiteread and Luigi Nono, space can become the material itself, changing the sound as it reads the space. Thank you so much for listening.